Berlin, winter 1917. A 13-year-old girl named Piet Keur sat down to dinner with her grandmother in their East Prussian home. The aroma that filled the house was wonderful, the smell of roasted meat, a luxury they hadn't enjoyed in months. With a mysterious look on her face, Piet wrote in her diary, Grandma placed a stewed bird with jacket potatoes on the table. It wasn't chicken, it wasn't game, it was a crow. Piet's grandmother had shot a crow in the garden and cooked it for dinner. This was what Berlin's middle class had been reduced to, eating birds normally considered vermin just to survive. In the streets outside, the situation was far worse. Children broke into barns searching for food. Malnourished mothers queued for hours, hoping to buy a single turnip, an animal feed crop that had become the staple of the German diet. In the summer of 1917, the food allocated offered only 1,560 calories daily and dropped to 1,000 calories per day in winter. The Imperial Health Office required 3,000 calories for a healthy adult male, 3 times what was available in winter. This wasn't caused by bombs. It wasn't caused by invading armies. Germany's cities weren't under siege in the traditional sense. There were no enemy soldiers at the gates. The enemy was hundreds of miles away, patrolling the gray waters of the North Sea. The Royal Navy had imposed a blockade so effective, so comprehensive, that it slowly strangled Germany's economy and starved its civilian population. The German Board of Public Health claimed that 763,000 German civilians died from starvation and disease caused by the blockade through December 1918. 763,000 people. That's more than twice the number of American combat deaths in all of World War II. And they didn't die on battlefields. They died in their homes, in hospitals, on the streets of German cities, victims of a weapon that killed silently but devastatingly: economic starvation. This is the story of the British naval blockade of Germany during the First World War, one of the most effective and controversial military campaigns in history. A campaign that helped win the war but cost hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. A strategy that violated international law but proved impossible for Germany to break. This is the story of how Britain weaponized hunger and how the Royal Navy starved Germany into defeat. Naval supremacy and the German threat. When war erupted in August 1914, the British Royal Navy was the most powerful naval force on Earth. It had maintained unchallenged dominance of the seas since Admiral Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805, over a century of supremacy. Both the German Empire and the United Kingdom relied heavily on imports to feed their population and supply their war industry. Imports of foodstuffs and war material of all European belligerents came primarily from the Americas and had to be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. Britain understood this dependency intimately. The island nation imported massive quantities of food. It couldn't feed itself from domestic production alone. But Britain controlled the world's largest merchant fleet and had naval bases spanning the globe. Germany had no such advantages. The British had the Royal Navy, which was superior in numbers and could operate throughout the British Empire, while the German Kaiserliche Marine surface fleet was mainly restricted to the German Bight. Before the war, economic warfare had been Britain's preferred strategy in case of European conflict. The Admiralty planned to use Britain's overwhelming naval superiority to blockade Germany, cutting it off from overseas supplies and gradually crushing its ability to wage war. The blockade began. On August 4, 1914, the very day Britain declared war on Germany, the Royal Navy began implementing the blockade. But this wouldn't be a traditional close blockade, where British ships sat directly outside German ports. That would expose the fleet to German mines, torpedoes, and submarines. Instead, Britain adopted a distant blockade. The Royal Navy followed a policy of distant blockade, barring entrance to the English Channel and the North Sea. British ships patrolled the waters between Scotland and Norway and between the English Channel and France, creating a massive net that caught any ship trying to reach German ports. In early November 1914, they declared the North Sea a war zone, with any ships entering at their own risk. Any vessel attempting to reach Germany would have to pass through British-controlled waters, and Britain would decide what they could carry. Expanding the definition of contraband. This is where things became controversial. Under international law, belligerents had the right to stop contraband of war, military supplies destined for enemy nations. Weapons, ammunition, explosives, these were clearly legitimate targets, but Britain didn't stop there. The blockade was unusually restrictive in that even foodstuffs were considered contraband of war. Think about the implications of that. Britain was declaring that bread, grain, meat, food that fed civilians was now a military target. The justification was that food sustained the enemy's war effort. Fed workers produced munitions, fed soldiers fought battles. Therefore, all food was contraband. Germany protested this violated international law. Neutral nations complained Britain was overstepping its authority, but Britain had the power to enforce its interpretation, and it did. Most neutral merchant vessels agreed to dock at British ports to be inspected and then escorted, lest any illegal cargo destined for Germany, through the British minefields to their destinations. The system worked like this. A ship sailing from America to Scandinavia would be stopped by British warships. The captain would be given a choice: sail to a British port for inspection or be seized. Most complied. If the cargo manifest showed anything Britain deemed contraband, including food, it was confiscated. The ship could then proceed, empty, to its destination. Neutral ships quickly learned to avoid carrying anything Britain might confiscate, and since Britain's definition of contraband included almost everything, trade with Germany collapsed. The impact was immediate and severe. By 1915, Germany's imports had already fallen by 55% from their pre-war levels, and the exports were 53% of what they were in 1914. Just 1 year into the war, Germany had lost more than half its overseas trade. Raw materials stopped arriving, industrial production declined, and most critically, food imports, which Germany depended on to feed its urban population, dried up. Germany wasn't self-sufficient in food production. Before the war, it had imported significant quantities of wheat, fats, and other staples. Now, those imports were cut off. The Royal Navy had created an invisible cage around Germany. No armies had invaded, no cities had been bombed, but Germany was slowly, methodically strangled. And the worst was yet to come. The perfect storm. By 1916, Germany faced a convergence of catastrophes that would create conditions for mass starvation. First, the blockade had been in effect for 2 years. Germany's overseas trade had collapsed. Industrial production suffered from lack of raw materials. Apart from leading to shortages in vital raw materials such as coal and metals, the blockade also deprived Germany of supplies of fertilizer that were vital to agriculture. Millions of men had been drafted into the army, including farm workers. Horses had been requisitioned for military transport. Nitrates that should have become fertilizer were being used to make explosives instead. German farms simply couldn't produce enough food. Third, Germany made a catastrophic policy mistake. In an attempt to solve both the potato and meat supply problems at the same time, the German government signed the death warrant for 9 million pigs out of a total of 27 million. The logic seemed sound: slaughter the pigs immediately for meat, solving the short-term meat shortage. But pigs were crucial sources of natural fertilizer. Without them, agricultural productivity collapsed further. German bureaucrats had unknowingly put another nail in the coffin of German agriculture. And fourth, and most devastating, the weather turned. When the potatoes died. At the peak of the food shortages in 1916, a late blight, a fungal disease that could have been prevented with copper-based fungicides, spread through the fields. But Germany had diverted its the strategic assessment. So did the blockade win the war for Britain? Not alone. Germany was defeated by a combination of factors: the British blockade, the French army on the Western Front, American entry into the war, the failure of Germany's spring 1918 offensive, and ultimately the collapse of German allies in autumn 1918. But the blockade was crucial. It prevented Germany from importing the raw materials needed for war production. Nickel, copper, rubber, all became critically scarce. The shortage of lubricants, petrol, and rubber was seriously affecting the army's mobility. It destroyed civilian morale. By 1918, Germans were exhausted, hungry, and desperate for peace. Workers struck. Sailors mutinied. The home front collapsed. It forced Germany into desperate strategic gambles, unrestricted submarine warfare that brought America into the war, sealing Germany's fate. Without the blockade, Germany could have sustained its war effort far longer. The Western Front might have remained stalemated. The war might have ended differently. In that sense, yes, the Royal Navy's blockade was instrumental in Allied victory. The moral reckoning. But at what cost? Between 400,000 and 800,000 German civilians died from starvation and malnutrition-related diseases. The vast majority were women, children, and the elderly, people who had no voice in Germany's decision to go to war. Was this justified? Defenders of the blockade argued that all's fair in war, especially total war. Germany's submarine campaign killed Allied civilians. German armies devastated occupied territories. The blockade was simply another weapon in the arsenal, and a legitimate one. Critics counter that deliberately starving civilians violates basic human morality, regardless of legal technicalities. That continuing the blockade for 8 months after the armistice, when Germany had surrendered and posed no military threat, was indefensible. The debate continues today. Modern international law, particularly the Geneva Conventions, was shaped partly in reaction to the blockade. Deliberately starving civilians is now clearly recognized as a war crime. But in 1914 to 1919, those laws didn't exist. Britain operated in a legal and moral gray area, using the most effective weapon it possessed, regardless of the human cost. Lessons for today. The British blockade of Germany teaches several enduring lessons about modern warfare. First, economic weapons can be as devastating as military ones. In an interconnected world dependent on global trade, cutting off access to markets and resources can destroy a nation's ability to fight. Second, civilian suffering in war is not just collateral damage, it's often the point. The blockade specifically targeted Germany's civilian population to undermine morale and productivity. This was deliberate strategy, not unfortunate accident. Third, power shapes international law. Britain violated numerous maritime laws, but faced no consequences because it had the military power to enforce its interpretation. International law constrains the weak more than the strong. Fourth, hunger is a weapon whose effects last long after the fighting stops. German children who survived the turnip winter suffered lifelong health problems. The social and political consequences of mass starvation contributed to the instability that led to World War II. Final thoughts. On a gray morning in November 1918, after 4 years and 3 months, the blockade achieved its objective. Germany surrendered. The Kaiser fled to exile. The German Empire collapsed. The Royal Navy had won without firing shots in the decisive battle. British sailors had patrolled cold, empty waters, while German civilians starved hundreds of miles away. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was devastatingly effective. The blockade of Germany is considered one of the key elements in the eventual Allied victory in the war. The British naval blockade of Germany during World War I was one of the most successful and controversial military campaigns in history. It helped win the war. It also killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. It proved that in modern total war, there are no non-combatants. Everyone, soldiers and civilians, men and women, adults and children, becomes a target. The Royal Navy didn't just blockade Germany's ports, it weaponized hunger. It turned hunger into a military strategy, and in doing so, it changed the nature of warfare.
Germany's desperate plan. Germany understood perfectly well what was happening. The blockade was slowly killing them. The only way to break it was to defeat the Royal Navy and open the sea lanes. But how could Germany challenge British naval supremacy? With 16 dreadnought-type battleships compared with the Royal Navy's 28, the German high seas fleet stood little chance of winning a head-to-head clash. Direct confrontation was suicide. Germany needed a different strategy. The plan was elegant. Lure part of the British fleet into a trap. German battle cruisers would raid the English coast, drawing out a portion of the British Grand Fleet. The main German battle fleet would then ambush and destroy the isolated British ships. If Germany could inflict enough damage over several such operations, the numerical balance might shift enough to risk a decisive battle. In January 1916, Admiral Reinhard Scheer took command of the German high seas fleet. Unlike his predecessor, Scheer believed the fleet had been used too defensively. He was determined to take the war to the British. The Battle of Jutland. On May 30, 1916, the entire German high seas fleet put to sea, 99 warships heading toward the Skagerrak, the waterway between Norway and Denmark. But British intelligence had cracked German naval codes. Room 40, a secret intelligence unit in the Admiralty building in London, intercepted German signals and warned Admiral John Jellicoe that a major German operation was imminent. Instead of a portion of the fleet, the entire British Grand Fleet, 151 warships, sailed to meet the Germans. On the afternoon of May 31, 1916, the two fleets met off the coast of Jutland in Denmark. The Battle of Jutland was the largest naval battle of the First World War. It was the only time that the British and German fleets of dreadnought-type battleships actually came to blows. For 12 hours, 250 ships and 100,000 men fought in a confused, bloody action across the gray waters of the North Sea. The initial phase went badly for Britain. German gunnery proved devastatingly accurate. HMS Indefatigable and HMS Queen Mary both exploded when German shells penetrated their ammunition magazines. Watching his battle cruisers blow up, British Admiral David Beatty remarked with characteristic understatement,
There seems to be something wrong with our ships today. By nightfall, the losses were tallied. 6,000 British and 2,500 German servicemen were lost during the conflict. Britain lost 14 ships, Germany 11. German newspapers proclaimed a great victory. They had sunk more British ships, killed more British sailors. Trafalgar had been reversed. But the strategic reality was different. Strategic victory, tactical defeat. Although it failed to achieve the decisive victory each side hoped for, the Battle of Jutland confirmed British naval dominance and secured its control of shipping lanes, allowing Britain to continue effective implementation of the maritime blockade. The outcome ensured that the Royal Navy denied German surface fleet access to the North Sea and the Atlantic for the remainder of the war. Germany avoided all fleet-to-fleet contact thereafter. Germany had won tactically, they'd sunk more ships, but they'd lost strategically, they hadn't broken the blockade. On July 4, 1916, Admiral Reinhard Scheer took command of the German High Seas Fleet. Scheer reported to the German High Command that further fleet action was not viable. The High Seas Fleet would never again seriously challenge British control of the North Sea. The blockade would continue, and Germany would continue to starve. The submarine option. Germany had one remaining option: unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany built new and larger U-boats to punch holes in the British blockade, which was threatening to starve Germany out of the war. In 1914, Germany had just 20 U-boats. By 1917, it had 140. German submarines could attack British merchant shipping, cutting Britain's own supply lines. If Germany could sink enough ships, Britain might be starved before Germany was. But submarine warfare came with a fatal problem. Submarines couldn't distinguish between military and civilian vessels, between Allied and neutral ships. Unrestricted submarine warfare meant sinking any ship in British waters, including those from neutral countries, including American ships. On May 7, 1915, German submarine U-20 torpedoed the Lusitania, a Cunard passenger liner off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 men, women, and children, including 128 Americans, lost their lives. American outrage forced Germany to abandon unrestricted submarine warfare, temporarily. But by early 1917, with Germany facing collapse from starvation, the decision was made to resume the campaign regardless of consequences. The food shortage finally led to a fateful decision in early 1917, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic. A desperate attempt to cut off the supply of food and war material to the British, and thus force an armistice before the situation in Germany could escalate any further. The campaign failed, and it brought America into the war, sealing Germany's fate. Germany had gambled everything on breaking the blockade, and lost.